It started like any other day in court, but everyone could feel it was different. The air had a strange weight to it, like something was coiled. Just out of sight, ready to snap, Sean Diddy Combs walked in through the side door like he always did, flanked by his legal team suited and muted gray head up, but something above him looked off, not panicked, not afraid, just unsettled. His eyes scanned the room a little longer than usual, pausing briefly on the jury box, then over at the prosecution's table. They weren't looking back at him. That was the first signal. They weren't posturing, weren't preparing. They were waiting, calm, silent, like hunters who already knew the animal was cornered. The judge entered 5 minutes later. No small talk, no half smiles, just a nod to the clerk, a glance at both tables, and a few quiet words that made the entire gallery lean forward. The session will begin with a motion submitted under seal. Defense, I trust you've reviewed the materials, as instructed. Diddy's lead attorney stood visibly thrown off. Your Honor, we received a digital notice late last night, but we were under the impression. The judge cut him off. Impressions don't override deadlines. The prosecution may proceed. The entire room shifted, not dramatically, but precisely the kind of shift that happens when everyone in their room except one man knows what's coming. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now let's get back to it. A cart was wheeled in with a mounted screen facing the jury. No witness took the stand. No new face entered, just the screen and a black U.S. bribe inserted by a court technician under the judge's nod. The lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered and first line of text appeared, dated, timestamp, Edenstrid. Origin traced to a device listed under a foreign corporate shell, once tied to Diddy's music label subsidiary. The line read, if this gets out, we're finished. No context, no under, just that the courtroom didn't react at first. They didn't need to, because all eyes, every single one, were now fixed on Diddy. He didn't blink, but didn't breathe either. Another message appeared, then another, a thread off conversations between anonymous accounts, each with careful phrasing, vague references, and time tags that lined up with moments already brought up in testimony. The names were redacted, but the intent wasn't. The messages didn't scream guilt, they whispered something worse: planning, strategy, cover-up. Diddy Saturday rose to object, citing unclear authentication. The prosecution handed over the blockchain verification receipts and international verification stamps. The judge accepted them into the sealed record without pause. By this point, Diddy's posture had changed. He wasn't leaning back anymore. He was sitting forward, one hand on his chin, eyes locked on the screen, like he was scanning every line for something familiar, something he hoped wasn't there. The next message hit harder. It was shorter, sharper, more specific. Shut it down before the feds asked questions. That was it. The room held its breath, and he didn't flinch, but he no longer looked confident. He looked like a man staring at something he thought was buried, something that had just clawed its way back to the surface. The courtroom wasn't moving, but the energy inside it was shifting fast, like the room itself had suddenly turned into a tunnel, pulling everything toward one inescapable point. The screen kept flashing message after message, each one more precise, more surgical. They weren't threats, they were instructions. A time-stamped log showed a conversation referencing an external contractor buying paid in full offshore. The defense team scrambled. One lawyer whispered furiously, another shaking her head. Another grabbed a legal pad and started writing in all caps. Diddy didn't look at them. He was still watching the screen, jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle twitching in his cheek. Then came the line that cracked the silence wide open: same night, same name, package moved, no leaks. The courtroom froze. The prosecution didn't explain. They didn't need to. The jury had already heard testimony days earlier about that same night, about a missing security footage file, about a guest list that had one name removed the morning after. Now it all had context. One juror visibly recoiled, another took a slow breath, like they were processing just how deep this thing really went. And across the room the judge sat still, expression unreadable but no longer casual. He was leaning forward, now elbows on the bench, fingers laced, eyes narrow directly on Diddy. The defense objected again. Your Honor, this isn't courtroom proser, this is ambush. But the judge's response was like a verdict in itself. You had access to this material and chose not to explore it. This court will not shelter oversight masquerading a strategy. That one line sucked the air out of the defense table. Diddy Finalimov just slightly, he sat back, rubbed his chin once, then stared down at the table. Not defeated, not panicking, just calculating. Like a man trying to mentally trace the chain of events that brought him to this exact moment and realizing the math wasn't in his favor. The next message sealed it. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a directive, a full plan: run the sweep, kill the server. Deny knowledge if it leaks, and it was dated the exact night before the federal subpoena was issued. Now the courtroom wasn't just tense, it was alive, buzzing, charged. Moments away from combustion, one of the prosecutors leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and just waited, like she knew this wasn't the climax, it was the warm-up. The judge glanced at the bailiff. Secure the exhibit, he said. Seal it immediately. Motion for obstruction is now on the table. Diddy looked up slowly, straight at the judge, and in that split second something passed between them. Not words, not accusations, but recognition. Diddy wasn't facing allegations anymore, was facing the truth, and the room knew it. The room had changed. Not just the tone, not just the pace, but the very atmosphere. It felt heavier, denser, like something unspoken was now sitting in the center of the courtroom, and everyone was circling it. The judge couldn't speak again right away. He didn't have to high size. Had done enough, and Diddy hadn't looked away. That brief stare between him and the bench had said it all, but what came next was something no one in that room expected. The prosecution didn't call a witness, they submitted a name, one name. It was typed in a single piece of paper, passed to the clerk, entered into the sealed record. Then a quiet motion was made to allow admission of corroborating evidence tied to previous sealed messages. The judge reviewed. It took less than a minute. He nodded, and that's when the projection changed again. This time it wasn't just messages, it was a transaction, a wire from a dummy corporation based in the Cayman Islands to a private consultant listed under an alias that had been flagged but never confirmed until now. The prosecutor read the final 4 digits of the recipient account, then turned to the jury. Those digits match confidential financial statement submitted last week by the defense themselves, she said, voice steady, quiet, devastating. The same account number your team insisted didn't exist. The defense stood. Objection: irregular, inflator, prejudicial. The judge simply held up a hand. Overruled. The evidence is admissible. The court has confirmed the chain of custody at the defense table. Did's team was unraveling in real time. Files were shuffled, phones buzzed under the desk. A junior associate reached over and whispered something directly into Diddy's ear. He didn't react, didn't nod, didn't blink, just kept staring at the screen like he was watching an avalanche fall in slow motion, and he knew there was nowhere left to run. Then the prosecutor stepped forward and said a single sentence: Your Honor, we request an immediate in-camera review for obstruction and formally request the defendant be advised of his rights. Under a revised charge set, and right there in front of the jury, in front of the press, stenographer, in front of a courtroom that had grown deathly still, the trap snapped shut. Diddy's face changed, not dramatically but definitively. His jaw slackened. His posture sank, and for the first time in this entire trial, the weight wasn't something he carried, it was something that pinned him to his seat. He looked to his attorney not with a question but with understanding, like a man who just realized this wasn't the fight anymore, this was the fallout. And the judge Heffenly leaned forward again and spoke with deliberate clarity. Mr. Combs, I'm formally notifying you that this court is sufficient basis to consider obstruction of justice charges pending full federal review. Do you understand? The words weren't loud, but they echoed. Did he nodded, once slow, tired, and silent for the first time in weeks. The courtroom didn't feel like a performance space, it felt like a holding cell. Everyone was locked into their seats, nobody daring to move because it felt like the slightest sound might crack the entire room open. The gallery had gone cold. The jury wasn't blinking, and he looked like he had already left his body. The judge sat still, letting the silence stretch, the kind of silence that drags the truth out. Whether you're ready for it or not. The lead prosecutor didn't push forward. She let the room sink into itself. Her work was done for now. The evidence had spoken. The digital trail had connected, and the man who once stood untouchable was now cornered, not by force, but by fact. Diddy's lawyer whispered something to him, a strategy, apavat, a possible motion. They were still trying to play chess in a game that had already ended. He didn't respond. He just sat back in his chair, hand over his mouth, eyes locked on the edge of the table, and then the judge leaned forward. Again, this court, he said slowly, deliberately, will now enter recess. Jurors will remain under protective instruction. Both parties will return tomorrow for preliminary review of amended charges. The gavel didn't slam, it tapped once quietly, and that soft knock carried the weight of 1,000 headlines. The courtroom buzzed, not with noise but energy. Reporters rose like shadows, already forming narratives in their minds. Some jurors shifted slight, like they were trying to wake themselves up from what they had just witnessed, and he didn't move, not until the marshals approached. They didn't cuff him, they didn't touch him. They just stood near, present. That was enough. He stood slowly, not in protest, not in performance, like a man moving through something he could no longer shape. As he walked toward the side door, every eye followed him, but he didn't look back, not once. Not even as the judge remained seated, watching the entire walk like it was the final chapter of a book he already knew the ending to, because in that moment it didn't matter what he had planned, didn't matter who he knew, what he'd built, how carefully he'd crafted the empire. The moment he realized he was trapped wasn't when they presented the evidence, it was when he understood that no one in the room was listening to the myth anymore. They were finally seeing the man, and they weren't looking away. They say you can hear truth when it finally drops, like something physical hitting the floor. That's exactly what it felt like when the courtroom emptied, not loud, not dramatic, just heavy, one step at a time, one breath at a time, as if no one could move too fast without risking breaking. The moment apart, the jury was escorted out a different exit than usual. 2 at a time, under watchful ICE. Reporters weren't allowed near them, but their faces said everything. Some pale, some stunned. One of them had his head down, hand rubbing the back of his neck, like he just walked through something radioactive inside. The courthouse federal agents were already making calls, not about Diddy's current charges. Those were being amended. The bigger question now was what came next, because the evidence didn't stop with him. The digital files, the offshore trails, the name drops, the message logs, they reach headband. One man, they touched an ecosystem. Diddy wasn't just trapped in a courtroom, was trapped inside a machine he helped build, and now it was turning back on him. Back in his private holding, Eerie sat alone. No entourage, no lawyers, just concrete walls and the silence used to control with noise. There were no press agents drafting a statement, no assistants fixing optics. Just him and the fact that for the first time there were no more moves to make. He looked around that small, stale room. The walls were closer than any crowd he'd ever performed for, and it hit him not in panic, but clarity. He'd built an empire on timing, and now timing had turned its back on him. Across the city, the media was catching up. Leaks began. Verified sources whispered about offshore payments, shredded NDAs. Vanished. Stafferson outlet published a headline in bold block text from mogul to marked Diddy's empire unravels under federal scrutiny. It was no longer about his brand, no longer about his past. Now it was about survival, and even that felt uncertain. The judge's voice echoed in Diddy's head over and over again. Do you understand? Headed not just the legal weight, not just the charges. He understood what it meant to lose the thing he valued most, control of a company or a case or a courtroom, but the control over the narrative, over perception, the illusion that he could always find a way out. No was inside a story he didn't write, and the ending wasn't up to him anymore. The next morning arrived without mercy. A cold sky hung over Manhattan. As black SUVs lined the courthouse alley, journalists pressed against barricades, microphones raised, cameras clicking. Even though they knew Diddy wouldn't enter through the front door, the public still hadn't heard his voice, not since the judge confirmed new charges were being considered, not since the evidence showed he'd crossed a line so precise, so intentional, that it stripped the courtroom of any remaining gray areas inside the halls of the federal building, where quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that carries weight, the kind that settles on your shoulders before you then enter the courtroom. When Diddy walked in through the secured hallway, he looked different, still dressed in sharp tailoring, yes, but stripped of presence. No air of performance. No trace of defiance, just a man walking into a room that no longer belonged to him. His hands were loosely clasped, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His team flanked him, whispering strategies and last-minute tingles, but it was like none of it was reaching him, because he already knew what was coming. The courtroom filled slow. The judge entered quickly, and the moment everyone had waited for unfolded without drama. Mr. Combs, the judge said tone, even this court has reviewed the materials introduced during yesterday's session as well as the supplemental motion. Submitted by the prosecution early this morning. Diddy didn't move you in, now formally under investigation for obstruction of justice in connection with sealed federal investigation. Strandre. This trial, your current release terms are revoked. You will remain in custody pending further proceedings. A few audible gasps slipped from the back rows before the bafe-snapped order in the court, but Diddy didn't flinch. He didn't shake his head or plead his case. He just nodded on, because the moment had arrived, the one that all those encrypted messages, hidden payments, and carefully managed public images were supposed to delay forever. The point where it didn't matter how powerful he once was, how famous, how feared. The court wasn't staring at a music mogul anymore. They were staring at a man caught inside his own silence. The judge continued, laying out next steps: transfer, formal filing, upcoming grand jury proceedings, but no one was listening. The room was watching Diddy, waiting to see if he'd say anything at all, but he did not when the gavel came down, not when the marshals flanked him, not when his attorney leaned in and whispered, "We can still make a deal." Because it wasn't about deals anymore, it was about the realization that had settled over him like a shadow. He had played every hand, used every tool, bought every second, and now the seconds were gone, and what was left was standing over him like a verdict already written. The courtroom cleared out slowly, like no one wanted to be the first to leave, even after the judge adjourned and the gavel echoed through the chamber. People just sat, some in shock, others in silence, trying to piece each other what had just unfolded. The whispers came next, hush, but intense, leaking through the cracks of every row. Lawyers murmuring to clerks, marshals exchanging looks, reporters scribbling notes so fast they tore the paper, and in the middle of all of it, Diddy was being escorted out, not cuffed, not dragged, but watched closely. His steps were slow, measured, like he had nowhere left to rush to, because rushing is for people trying to stay ahead of something, and for the first time in his career, Sean Combs wasn't ahead. He was behind the curve, behind the truth, behind silence that had finally started to speak louder than any record he ever dropped. As he walked through the back hallway, down the restricted corridor leading to holding, you could see it. He wasn't just exhausted, he was cracked, not broken in the way the public imagines, not hysterical or begging for mercy. This was different. It was the quiet of a man who had calculated every move his entire life, and finally Renito won. He didn't see coming. Inside, holding his legal team, followed a private room had been arranged not for comfort, but because of who he was. Not even Diddy could be placed with the general population, not yet, not while the world was still on fire outside. The attorney closest to him dropped a folder on the table. "This is the beginning of a long process here," he said. "You still have leverage. We control what's said next." But Diddy didn't reach for the folder. He just stared at the wall. "You understand me?" The lawyer asked again, firmer this time. No response, because in Diddy's head it wasn't about damage control anymore. The headlines had already moved beyond his reach. The messages, the transactions, the court's ruling, those things weren't up for spin. Existed, tangible, permanent, and worse, they were corroborated. There was no magic trick left, no unreleased footage, no carefully curated statement, no surprise guest witness. That was the trap. Not that they caught him off guard, but that they built a case so tight he never saw the room closing in until he was already in it. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the media wasn't just reporting, they were circling. Anchors, pundits, and former collaborators were weighing in on live streams. By the minute, the headlines wrote themselves. Sean Combs taken into custody, obstruction charges confirmed amid explosive evidence, Diddy's legacy under federal fire. And with every tick of that clock, the internet grew louder, not with praise, not even with outrage, but with curiosity. People weren't watching his fall to cheer or mourn. They were watching because it didn't seem real. How could a man who had once stood on every stage, graced every cover, turned every deal, now sit behind a gray table in a holding cell with no words left? That's what made it real, not the evidence, not the charges, but the silence. The look on his face when the door closed behind him, when the last defense crumbled, when the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. And behind it wasn't a mogul. It was a man who had run out of exits. It happened in a single breath, a shift barely noticeable unless you were watching closely, but everyone was. The door had just closed behind the judge. The courtroom was supposed to be in recess, but no one moved, not the jury, not the defense, not even Diddy, especially not Diddy. He sat motionless in thigh-backed leather chair, like he couldn't feel the floor beneath him anymore, like gravity itself had been replaced My something else heavier. His attorney leaned in again, trying to speak low discreet, but his voice carried just enough to be heard by the rows behind him. They've connected it. Sean, it's not just theory anymore. Still no reaction, but that was the moment. The precise second it hit him, not the charges, not the courtroom drama, not the sealed exhibits. Oh, the headlines outside the realization went deeper. It wasn't a booth case anymore. It was about the setup he wasn't watching evidence appear out of. Nowhere he was watching a puzzle comediture that had been built long before he sat in that chair piece by piece, quietly, carefully, coldly, and he'd walked right into the middle of it, all those encrypted texts, the offshore wires, the coded phrases. He had assumed they were buried deep enough, forgotten enough, legal enough, but the prosecution hadn't come at him hidden. They had waited, they had let him talk, let him deny, let him exhale, then they struck. The timeline matched, the messages matched. And worst of all, someone had been talking behind the scenes. Someone close. That's when the color shifted in his face, just slightly, the slightest twitch in his jaw. The faintest downward flick of his gaze. He wasn't angry, he wasn't scared, he was trapped. And now he knew it. Outside, the headlines were still catching up. The public was just now realizing that this wasn't a typical celebrity trial. This was something more calculated, something meant to peel away the myth layer by layer. But inside that courtroom, the show was already over. The prosecutors had played it like a symphony. They knew when to be quiet, when to press, when to stop. They didn't need a confession. They'd laid a trail and let Diddy walk it himself, in front of a jury, in front of the judge, in front of the world. And now, sitting alone, surrounded by murmurs and the creak of gallery benches, he didn't even reach for his water, didn't speak, just stared straight ahead. It wasn't disbelief, it wasn't confusion, it was recognition. He realized. Been maneuvered, positioned, and boxed in with every calculated silence he had once used to control others. He realized the strategy had failed, that the walls were real, not metaphorical, and the floor he'd stood on for decades gone. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. That was the moment Sean Combs realized he wasn't walking out of this, he was already inside something far bigger than himself, and there was no way out. The tension didn't break, it hardened like it was crystallizing in. The air pulling tighter around every person in that courtroom. Even though the judge had recessed, no one left. Reporters stood frozen near the backhand, still their notepads but not writing. The jurors sat stiffly, side eyes flicking toward each other, processing what they had just witnessed in complete silence. The prosecution didn't pack up their files. The defense didn't speak again, and did he stayed in that chair, shoulders no longer squared, head dipped slight, like someone finally seeing the edges of a map they thought they had drawn themselves. He was beginning to understand, not just that the case had turned, not just that the evidence was damning, but that the courtroom had already made its emotional decision. The jury had watched the truth unfold in real time, not through arguments or objections, but through digital trails, paperless footprints, and a silence so lewd it deafened everything else. The prosecution had weaponized restraint. They didn't shout, they didn't accuse they simply presented, and it worked, because when truth comes in whispers, not screams, it lands harder. And this truth, his truth, had just landed. Diddy glanced at the empty witness stand, the flickering monitor now dark, and for a split second his expression cracked. Not a tear, not a breakdown, but a flicker of something worse, regret, the kind you can bury under fame, the kind that creeps in when the show is over. And the only person left to face is yourself. Across the courtroom, one of the jurors stilted, her head squinting slightly, as if she wasn't looking at a defendant anymore. She was looking at a man unraveling in real time. The door behind the judge's bench opened again. A clerk entered, quietly whispered something to the prosecution, then slipped out without explanation. No words were exchanged, just a nod, another piece moving into place, another unseen part of the machinery locking into motion. And did he saw it? He caught that glance, the nod, the stillness, and that's when he fully understood. They weren't done. This wasn't the climax. This was just the moment they paused to let him feel the weight before dropping more ether. With more names, more dates, more files, he wasn't the final destination, he was the key, and now that key had turned in the lock as the courtroom slowly began to empty, people stepping backward, like they were leaving a sacred site rather than a federal hearing. The image that lingered was unforgettable. Diddy alone at the defense table, motionless, he's locked on nothing. Surrounded by the shattered pieces of the silence he believed would protect him, because now he knew the silence had been speaking. Whole time he just hadn't listened. The courthouse was nearly empty now, just a few federal agents lingering By the doors whispering into radios, the lights above the bench dimmed, slightly casting long shadows across the floor, stretching toward the defense table, where Sean Diddy Combs still sat. Everyone else had left: his lawyers, the jurors, the prosecution. But he hadn't moved, not in the way that mattered. He wasn't just sitting in a chair anymore. He was sitting in the truth. Everything that had defined him, his empire, his mystique, his control, had been peeled back. With surgical precision, the courtroom didn't take it from him with accusations or shouting matches. It took it piece by piece. A message here, a data theory, a wire transfer that shouldn't exist, a name that reappeared one. Too many times he thought silence would protect him, that the lack of a direct confession would keep the armor on. But it hadn't. Because what destroyed him wasn't a scream, it was a whisper backed by receipts. Now he sat in the aftershock. He's unfocused, the weight of the gavel still ringing in the back of his mind. Somewhere in the building, federal clerks were preparing the updated filing paperwork. Somewhere else, another team was finalizing the list of names his case had now implicated. No one said it out loud, but everyone in that courthouse knew. They had used Diddy as the first domino. The investigation didn't end with him. It began with him, and he finished youngers. That the silence he held on to for so long wasn't silence at all. It was noise, disguised as strategy, deals made behind closed doors, payouts routed through third parties, lawyers whispering, "Don't say anything, we'll handle it." But it hadn't been handled. It had been documented, and the system doesn't care how many records you've sold. It doesn't care how big your brand is. It cares about evidence. And Diddy had just watched it mount against him in real time, undeniable, irreversible, and permanent. The moment wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it was quiet, still, like watching the tide go out and realizing the sand beneath he was crumbling. He finally stood, no words, just a slow rise, and when he looked toward the gallery, even though it was nearly empty, he seemed to search for someone, maybe not a person, maybe just a piece of the life he once controlled. But no one was there, because that version of him no longer existed. He turned toward the marshals. They didn't need to say a word. They just nodded, opened the secure hallway door, and let him walk forward one step, then another, and with each one, the echo of who he used to be faded a little more. Outside, the world was waiting. Headlines already flooding in, podcasts being recorded, commentators drawing battle lines. Some would call it a fall from grace, others would call it justice. But inside the courthouse, where no cameras were allowed, where reputations mean nothing, where only truth survives, the final scene had already been written, not with handcuffs, not with rage, but with realization. Sean Combs didn't leave that courtroom the way he entered it. He left as a man who finally knew he wasn't the one holding power anymore. He was the story, and this time he didn't get to write the ending.